Hi, everyone. Welcome to Provider Office Hours. I appreciate you all being here to learn a little bit more about the Center for Outcomes-Based Contracting and how OBCs can really transform your partnerships with K-12 districts. A little bit about myself. I help lead our provider strategy and engagement at the Center for Outcomes-Based Contracting. Before joining the center, I have a provider background. I was at a provider as a product manager, also on the account management and sales side. So I have a depth of experience, and what brings me to the center, what gets me excited about OBCs and why I'm here in front of you is because I love the sustainable partnerships that OBCs bring naturally between providers and districts. So our objectives for today. First, we're going to define what outcomes-based contracting is. There is some of you on the call here that might be wondering, what is OBC? How is it different than the ABCs, right? So we're going to first just define it. Then we're going to dig a little bit deeper and get into the OBC pricing model and rate cards. Some of you might have seen a rate card before, so we'll demystify the rate card a little bit together today. We'll understand deeply how OBCs can support your organization, making sure that we walk out knowing that OBCs aren't just something that's being done to us as providers, but it's something that if we can figure out how to harness it, it's a real true market advantage and can better your business. And then lastly, before we leave together today, we'll identify next steps on how to partner with a district through an OBC. So thanks for being here. Getting us started, what is outcomes-based contracting? Or as you will hear us say quite a bit, OBC. Defining an OBC. So in an outcomes-based contract, a substantial part of the contract is contingent on meeting agreed upon student outcomes. So that means districts and providers will commit to clearly defined responsibilities to meet those outcomes. And what it does is it empowers districts and providers to contract for clear student outcomes and compels mutual accountability for achieving them. The goals for an OBC, one is to improve educational procurement practices by defining desired outcomes from the start. Second is to strengthen the implementation of instructional products and services, improving both the usage in the classroom and bringing them back to their research-backed design. And lastly, as named before, to empower districts and providers to partner together in achieving meaningful results for all students, regardless of background or circumstance. Just like any good recipe, OBCs have clear ingredients that make them successful. So every successful OBC will have continuous improvement built into it. It will have clearly defined outcomes and metrics. There will be a defined population. There will be contingent outcome payments, as well as mutual accountability. So the actions that both districts and providers will take to make sure that student outcomes are met. And really hammering it home, what is the difference between a traditional contract versus an outcomes-based contract? So in a traditional contract or a traditional partnership, the contract is paid in full when the services begin, and further payment is rendered as additional services are delivered. So again, in a traditional contract, the payment is paid out in full at the beginning. In an outcomes-based contract, the base payment, which is usually around 50 or 60% of the total contract value, the base payment of the contract is paid when services begin. And then the remainder of that contract, or the contingent payment, is paid out when the student outcomes are met. A traditional partnership, roles and responsibilities around that partnership might not always be clearly defined. I've seen some contracts that sometimes are just even POs, so there's really no roles and responsibilities of what the district is supposed to do and what the provider is supposed to do to meet those outcomes. In an outcomes-based contract, There are specific implementation expectations, both for the district and for the provider, and that's what we refer to as mutual accountability. And those are clearly agreed to when signing and executing the contract. And lastly, in a traditional contract, stakeholders work independently to identify ways to increase usage and improve student learning. Whereas in an OBC, the stakeholders are coming together to review data collaboratively and discuss opportunities for improvement together. And again, we refer to this process as continuous learning. So continuous learning, when we talk about OBC, is when all the various stakeholders, the provider, the district leaders, the school leaders, come together, look at data to progress monitor how everyone's doing along to meet the goals, and we'll make plans and interventions to get everyone back on track if they're ever off track. We're also seeing a growing demand for OBC across the country, and it's continuing to grow. So the Center for Outcomes-Based Contracting, we support districts in a cohort learning style. And so our first cohort in 2022, we had 4 districts: Denver Public, Duval County, Ector County, and Fulton County. And ever since, we just continue to grow. So you can see we represent some of the largest districts in the country, many top 10, top 100 size districts here, many districts in large states that have large buying power, like Florida, Texas, California. And again, it's a national movement. So even though we're at the center, even though we're at the Southern Education Foundation, it is a national movement, and we're absolutely seeing this as we head into 2025. We're starting to see state level agreements and state level interest, which is very exciting. All right, so why OBC? Why now? So mutual accountability, which we just talked about, mutual accountability promotes partnership and strengthens implementation. As districts are reviewing their budgets, reviewing their hundreds, in many cases thousands of digital product subscriptions, they're looking to see which products are actually being used and implemented correctly in the classroom. And OBCs provide the framework to ensure that programs are actually being implemented the way the research says it should be. OBCs also offer financial incentives for districts and providers to ensure student learning remains the central focus. So again, it is in writing, it is on paper, the actions that both districts and providers will take to ensure that students are using the program. And there's financial incentives for that. So everyone is truly held accountable and incentivized to ensure that the program is being implemented the way it should be, both districts and providers. And lastly, we saw during COVID, during the ESSER funding era, that there's a lot of digital tools in our schools, in the classrooms across districts, some that district leaders know that classroom teachers are using, some that they don't, right, because they're being purchased individually by the teachers. And so there is now a moment where everyone is stopping and auditing everything that's being used, right? What do we need to have keep budget for? What is it that we want our students using, and why do we want them using it? And so OBCs really showcase a clear impact because you're connecting your program directly to ROI, to student learning outcomes. And that is just an absolute market advantage and makes programs incredibly competitive in this very competitive landscape that we're all familiar with. All right, what are the benefits of an OBC for providers? So let's now go a step deeper. And I'm sure everyone who's following along, if you're still following along, thank you, I appreciate you. But let's go a step deeper into how the payment works, because that's typically the first set of questions that we get. How does the payment work? You know, you get paid sometimes 50, 60% in the base payment up front, and then the rest is paid out when student learning outcomes are met. Like, how does that work? That's usually the first questions we get. So at a very high level, what you'll see here on the left is the traditional contract. That is the total contract value, and that is the price for delivery. What you'll see here are two examples. So this middle column, the light blue is that base payment, that 50 or 60% that we talked about before. That gets paid out at the beginning of the contract. And then there's payment tied to specific learning outcomes. So we see here outcome 1, outcome 2, outcome 3. And once those student learning outcomes are met, you get paid out for each and every student that meets those learning outcomes. And so you can see if every student were to hit their learning outcomes, there is an increase in total contract value and total potential payout. And a lot of that is because the partnership is taking on an increased risk, right? So we say increase in risk, increase in payout, because it really incentivizes both parties coming together to make sure that all those learning outcomes for every student is met. What we typically see, right, we would love to live in a world that every single student meets every single learning outcomes, right? We understand that that's not likely going to happen. We'll name that. And so what this third column here is an actual payout, what we typically see. So again, that base payment, and then payments for outcome 1, outcome 2, outcome 3 to reflect the realistic percentage of students who would meet the learning outcomes. Again, you'll still see in many scenarios it ends up being higher than the traditional contract value because there is incentive for that risk that you're taking. Taking it one step further, because I'm sure there are still questions after what I just shared. Here on the left, we have a traditional contract. Here on the right, we have an OBC. So what you'll see on the left in this EdTech example, what you'll see here on the left is we have a line item for all the licenses, as well as the workshops and additional services that might be included in the contract. In an OBC, it's all-inclusive pricing per student. So you don't see line items for each input. Instead, you just see the payments that are possible for each output. So we're really transitioning, making a paradigm shift to go from paying for inputs versus paying for outputs. So all of the additional services that are on top of the licenses are built into the per student pricing. So whatever professional learning is needed, whatever coaching is needed to help support the implementation and get students to the learning outcomes that we need them to get to should be baked right into your rate card. So here we'll see a base payment, $20 per student, or a cap maxed out at 60,000, right? We need to protect district's budget, so it's maxed, there's a payment cap at 60,000. And then for every student that hits outcome 1, growth on NWEA, there's $17. And for every student who hits outcome 2, proficiency on basic phonics skills test, gets $13. And so if, as a partnership, for every student who hits their outcomes, there's a $50 payment. One last thing that I'll share before I move on. The rate card also signals what the district is prioritizing. So what we can see here is the district is willing to pay out more per student for hitting outcome 1 versus outcome 2. And what this means is that's what they're prioritizing through what they're showing. The price per outcome is they're also showing their priorities. And so that's really helpful when we think about our program and our partnership. What is it that we should be prioritizing together? What are our focus areas? And it really helps prevent against scope creep, which I know is something that we often can experience in partnerships where additional desires or additional outcomes or can be added to programs midway. OBCs really protect against that because they're so clearly labeled with a price tag next to it in the contract. And it's something that we've heard very positively about from many client success teams and implementation teams. And so I've said this a few times, and I just want to really repeat it because this is a common misconception in OBCs, is that getting those student outcomes is shared accountability across so many stakeholders in the partnership. It's not just the provider's job, it's not just the district's job, it's it's everyone's role together. There's shared accountability. And there's language written into the contracts to protect both parties for that. So if the district doesn't follow through with the actions that's outlined for them in the mutual accountability section, the provider is protected and will still get paid out. In the same way in reverse, if the provider doesn't follow through with the actions that is outlined for them in the contract, the district then doesn't have to pay, right? So there's really clear um, accountability in the contract, and each party is protected in case the other side of the partnership isn't able to fulfill their requirements. And so here on your screen, I'm not going to go through and read these all, but here on your screen, you'll see some examples that are in contracts of those buffers that safeguards that we talked about that are in contracts to make sure of what is it that each party is supposed to do and what would happen if the party is unable to follow through with them. So I'll pause here for a sec. An example is if the district is responsible for attendance, and these are all customizable, of course, for any student who falls below an average of 75% of the recommended dosage, the district may be required to pay both base outcomes for the student and for a given time frame. That was just one example. So I'm going to pause here. Thank you so much for all of you who made it to the end. I appreciate you for taking time to learn more about outcomes-based contracts. We have monthly office hours for providers, so please join us.